Human communication is not a simple exchange of words. It's a layered, intricate dance of signals, gestures, silences, and subtexts that weave together meaning far beyond what is spoken. When a person chooses silence over speech, especially someone close to you, it's not always because they have nothing to say. It's often because what they could say might be dangerous, or because their care runs so deep that words would fail to capture it without distortion. The human psyche is structured in such a way that we are constantly filtering our impulses, shaping our expressions through a web of social and emotional calculations that we often do not consciously recognize. To interpret silence as mere absence is a failure to appreciate the staggering complexity of how we convey meaning, especially in intimate relationships. Imagine the mind as a turbulent ocean. Above the surface, calmness. Below, unspoken storms. When someone ignores you, it might be that their internal storm is too fierce, and showing it would risk damaging both themselves and their relationship. It's an act of restraint, not absence. In psychological terms, this is called affect regulation, the deliberate act of holding back emotional expression in order to maintain social cohesion and prevent unnecessary harm. This is not weakness or coldness. It's a profound demonstration of self-control and long-range thinking. People often mistake immediacy for honesty, believing that expressing everything at all times is a virtue. But human interaction does not work that way. If every emotional impulse were acted upon in raw form, society would collapse into chaos. Relationships require a careful balance between honesty and diplomacy, between revealing and concealing. The act of ignoring, when done from a place of care, is not passive aggressiveness. It's a disciplined form of communication. It's an ethical choice to avoid pouring volatile emotions into a shared space where they could cause lasting damage. Consider that when someone chooses silence, they may be engaging in an internal battle, weighing their words, measuring the potential impact of their reactions. Silence, in this sense, is not emptiness, but presence. Presence in another form. A person might ignore you because they are choosing not to weaponize their frustration or disappointment. They might be stepping back, allowing themselves time to cool down, so that when they return to you, their words are precise, measured, and constructive rather than destructive. That act requires strength. It is far easier to lash out than to remain silent. Now think about how we, as individuals, often react to silence. There's a tendency to interpret it through a lens of insecurity, assuming it means rejection or disinterest. But that's projection. What we must learn is to develop the emotional intelligence necessary to differentiate between silence that signals apathy and silence that signals care, filtered through self-regulation. The former is empty, the latter is full. And that requires paying attention not just to what is absent, but to everything surrounding it, the context, the patterns, the history, the subtleties. Communication is not linear, it's multidimensional. Words exist in one dimension. Silences, gestures, eye contact, and tone of voice fill in the rest. To focus only on what is spoken is to see the tip of the iceberg and ignore the vast structure beneath the surface. The way someone withdraws can be as telling as the way someone speaks. Do they withdraw with tension in their body, with averted eyes, with trembling hands? Those are not signs of disinterest, but of inner conflict. That conflict exists because they care. Otherwise, they wouldn't bother to regulate themselves at all. Furthermore, human beings are not built for constant connection. There is a psychological necessity for distance, moments to process, to reflect, to regain equilibrium. When a woman ignores you, it might be her way of recalibrating her emotional state to engage with you more effectively later. If she didn't care, there would be no recalibration. Indifference would manifest as indifference, not silence. Silence in this form is an active process, not a passive state. It's effortful, it's heavy. Silence as communication has roots in evolutionary psychology. In tribal societies, nonverbal cues were often more critical than spoken language, especially when survival depended on reading subtle shifts in behavior. That instinct persists. When someone who cares about you chooses not to speak, they are engaging in a form of ancient signaling, preserving the integrity of the relationship by not allowing raw emotion to tear through it unchecked. This is not simply about self-preservation. It's about preserving the shared social fabric that binds individuals together. There is also a moral component to this type of silence. Speaking impulsively when emotions are high can destroy trust, respect, and safety within a relationship. Choosing to remain silent is a moral act, a deliberate refusal to cause unnecessary harm. This act of self-silencing is, paradoxically, one of the most profound forms of care because it values the long-term health of the bond over the short-term release of frustration or anger. To ignore someone as a form of care is to place the relationship above the self in that moment. Think about the discipline required for such silence. Discipline is not merely the act of doing what is necessary, but often the act of not doing what is harmful, even when it feels justified. That is true strength. In a world where people are encouraged to express every thought, holding back becomes a radical, almost heroic act. This is not suppression, it is mastery. It is what separates the impulsive from the wise, the immature from the mature. It is a signal, not of detachment, but of depth. The human brain is wired to detect patterns, but when we encounter silence, that pattern detection falters. We struggle with ambiguity, and yet growth occurs in the space where certainty is absent. Relationships that endure are those in which both parties can tolerate ambiguity long enough to uncover the truth beneath the silence. That requires trust. Trust that care is still present even when words are not. Trust that the other person is working through something in service of something greater than temporary emotional release. What we must internalize is that silence, true, deliberate silence, is a high-level form of communication that demands respect, patience, and interpretation. It is a space held open, waiting for something better than anger or impulsiveness to fill it. It is, in its most noble form, a gift, a breathing space where mutual understanding can eventually take root. In the structure of human relationships, there exists an invisible weight, an unseen burden carried not with words or visible actions, but through the quiet and persistent regulation of emotional states. When a woman chooses to disengage, to momentarily ignore, it is often not an act of cruelty, but one of calculated discipline, where she absorbs the weight of her own emotions to protect the relationship from unnecessary fracture. Emotional regulation is not merely about self-restraint. It is a form of silent responsibility, a task that often goes unnoticed precisely because it is done so effectively. It is one of the clearest signals of psychological maturity, requiring strength to carry feelings that would be easier and perhaps more immediately gratifying to unleash. There is a cost to unfiltered emotional expression, and this cost is measured in trust, safety, and respect. In moments of intense emotion, anger, disappointment, frustration, it is far simpler to speak rashly, to release that heat into the relationship without concern for its long-term consequences. But to step back, to say nothing, to deliberately withhold words when the impulse screams otherwise, that is not avoidance, that is mastery. When a woman ignores you, she may in fact be performing a crucial act of preservation, preserving herself, preserving you, preserving the bond that ties you together. She bears the emotional load quietly, sparing you from its raw impact. Human beings are built with layers of emotional circuitry. There are primitive, reactive systems that want immediate satisfaction, the urge to shout when hurt, to retreat when offended, to blame when confused. But layered on top of that is the uniquely human ability to regulate those impulses, to pause, to choose a different path. Emotional regulation is not suppressing emotions until they disappear. It is holding them carefully, navigating them with intent, making sure they are expressed only in forms that do not cause disproportionate damage. In relationships, women are often socially and psychologically conditioned to carry more of this weight, to manage not only their internal storms, but also to anticipate and soften yours. It is not weakness to step back from conflict. It is a higher order strength. It requires effort, concentration, and long-term thinking to disengage strategically rather than act impulsively. When she ignores you, it can be a form of boundary setting, a necessary recalibration of her own emotional world. She might be allowing herself time to breathe so that her future engagement with you is more constructive. That distance is not emptiness. It is space made for clarity to emerge. Imagine for a moment the force required to stand in the middle of an emotional hurricane and choose stillness. That is what emotional regulation demands. It demands that she takes the raw material of frustration, confusion, and vulnerability and tempers it into something sharper, clearer, more purposeful. She is not ignoring you because she does not care. She is ignoring you because she is refining her response, turning chaos into order before offering it back to you in a form that does not destroy what has been built between you. This process is invisible from the outside, but monumental within. The human nervous system reacts automatically to perceived threats. In relationships, these threats are not physical, but emotional. Rejection, betrayal, misunderstanding. When those triggers are activated, the default response is to fight or flee. Emotional regulation interrupts that automatic process. It inserts choice where before there was only instinct. It is the difference between someone who burns down every bridge at the first sign of trouble and someone who waits for the storm to pass before deciding which path to take. When she ignores you, it may be precisely this pause, the creation of that space between impulse and action, that protects both of you from irreversible damage. Every relationship involves power dynamics, spoken and unspoken. Emotional regulation is a form of power, not over others, but over oneself. It is the ability to hold tension without snapping, to delay expression until the right moment. It is not silence born from fear, it is silence born from wisdom. A woman who cares enough to regulate her emotions in your presence values not just her own peace, but the shared peace between you. She absorbs what could become an argument and transforms it into reflection. That transformation is a private, internal labor that often goes unseen and unacknowledged. There is an extraordinary discipline in waiting to speak until the heart is calm. It is not merely about being polite. It is about ensuring that what is said contributes to growth rather than destruction. Emotional regulation in this sense is like a craftsman's tool. It carves the shape of the relationship slowly, carefully, ensuring that sharp edges are softened before they touch the other person. Ignoring you in a moment of emotional intensity is not indifference. It is craftsmanship applied to human connection. We live in a culture that often glamorizes immediate expression. Say what you feel right now without filter. But maturity demands a different rhythm. Maturity asks, will these words help or harm? Will this reaction bring us closer or tear us apart? The ability to pause and ask those questions before acting is emotional regulation at its highest form. When she steps back, when she becomes silent, when she chooses absence over confrontation, it is because she is giving herself the space to answer those questions honestly before bringing her emotions to you. There is a silent dignity in choosing not to escalate. In the moments when a relationship feels fragile, when tempers flare and patience wears thin, the choice to regulate one's own emotions rather than unload them is a gesture of care. It is an unspoken agreement to protect what matters most, even when the temptation to speak harshly is overwhelming. That restraint is not visible to the world, but it shapes the relationship's future in profound ways. Think about how fire behaves. Left unchecked, it consumes everything in its path. Controlled, it warms, it illuminates, it sustains life. Emotions are like fire. When she ignores you, instead of unleashing her full emotional force, she is choosing to control the flame rather than let it burn everything down. That choice is rarely easy. It demands a kind of internal strength that many people never develop. It is a choice made not for her benefit alone, but for the benefit of both people involved. Carrying the weight of emotional regulation is exhausting. It requires sustained effort, particularly when faced with repeated triggers. Yet she does it because the alternative, chaos, conflict, collapse, is worse. Every time she steps back, instead of lashing out, she is investing in the future of the relationship. That investment is made in silence, in patience, in self-discipline. It is not dramatic or visible. It is quiet, steady work done in the background, like a foundation being laid beneath a building. The highest form of care is not loud. It does not always declare itself. Sometimes the most profound care is shown through restraint. The choice not to say the first thing that comes to mind. The willingness to bear discomfort privately rather than share it recklessly. Emotional regulation is the mechanism through which that restraint becomes possible. It is the invisible scaffolding that holds a relationship upright, even when external pressures threaten to tear it down. There is no shortcut to mastering this skill. It is learned through struggle, through experience, through moments of failure and recovery. Each time she chooses silence, it is because she has learned, perhaps painfully, that unleashing raw emotion does not build bridges, it burns them. And so she carries the weight. She bears it in silence, trusting that in time, what needs to be said will be said more clearly, more kindly, more constructively. That trust is not weakness. It is the core strength that keeps human relationships from falling into ruin. The ability to interpret silence maturely separates a reactive mind from a disciplined one, because silence is not a blank space, but a canvas painted with unspoken intentions and invisible emotions that demand the highest level of awareness to perceive. In the realm of human relationships, particularly between a man and a woman, interpreting silence with wisdom rather than fear reveals the strength of your own character and the depth of your understanding, because silence has its own language, one that does not reveal itself to the impatient or the insecure. Most people rush to fill the void of quiet with noise, assuming that absence of words equates to absence of care. Yet this is a fundamental misreading of human complexity. Since care does not always shout, it often whispers, and sometimes it does not speak at all. When she pulls back, when her voice quiets and her presence feels distant, there exists an opportunity not for panic but for patience, because those moments are not always a withdrawal of love but a recalibration of it. Silence tests you, not as a punishment, but as a mirror reflecting your own emotional maturity. The question is whether you have the strength to endure ambiguity without resorting to rash judgments or defensive reactions, because true maturity is the capacity to hold opposing truths in your mind without needing to resolve them immediately. Silence might mean she is struggling with her own emotions, seeking clarity before returning to you with honesty rather than confusion. But if you cannot endure that waiting, you will destroy the very trust she is trying to protect. There is a weight in misinterpreting silence too soon. To presume rejection when there is merely reflection is to write endings where there were only pauses. This kind of premature assumption reveals more about your own insecurities than about her intentions, because relationships are not built solely through spoken affirmation. They survive in the silent spaces between words, in the unseen moments where both people must choose trust over fear. That trust is not instinctive, it is forged through discipline, through choosing not to catastrophize, through resisting the urge to demand constant reassurance, because demanding immediate answers from someone in silence is often an act of selfishness disguised as vulnerability. It says, "Relieve me of my discomfort," rather than, "I trust you enough to give you space." The mature man learns to wait without collapsing into self-doubt because he understands that human emotions, particularly in complex relationships, move like tides. They ebb and flow, they rise and fall, sometimes leaving the shore bare before the waves return, stronger than before. Her silence is not necessarily the sign of something ending. It is often the sign of something being processed carefully, responsibly. And if you rush in with your fears, you interrupt that process, turning a moment that required patience into a conflict that demanded none. Interpreting silence maturely means understanding that not everything urgent is important and not everything quiet is void. When a woman chooses not to speak, especially during emotionally charged situations, she may be building a bridge back to you in her own mind, constructing her words in a way that preserves both dignity and truth. Interrupting that silence with your impatience is like destroying the bridge before it is complete. Mature interpretation of silence is not passive waiting. It is active trust. It is choosing to believe in the integrity of the other person even when their behavior momentarily contradicts your expectations. Most people fail at this because they measure relationships by constant feedback loops, forgetting that the strongest bonds do not always require immediate confirmation. They exist beneath the surface, like the roots of a tree, unseen but deeply present. Every silence carries a question, and the question is this: can you endure uncertainty long enough to discover what lies beyond it? This is the same question life asks in every difficult situation. Can you stand still while the storm passes, or will you run in fear and lose your footing? Silence from someone who cares about you is often not a void, but a signal asking for your patience and strength. You cannot handle silence, you cannot handle depth, because depth demands space, and space is always filled with quiet. There is no profound connection without the ability to withstand moments of distance. Human psychology is such that we crave closure, but closure is not always immediate nor always deserved. Sometimes closure must be earned through waiting, through sitting with discomfort rather than fleeing from it. When she does not speak, when she ignores you momentarily, she is often wrestling with her own demons, her own uncertainties, trying to find a version of herself that can re-engage with you without causing harm. If you make her silence about you, you fail to see her struggle. You make it about your fear instead of her process. That is not strength, that is ego. And ego will always destroy what patience could have preserved. Interpreting silence maturely means learning to read between the lines of behavior, to see the patterns rather than just the moments. If she has shown care consistently before, her silence now is likely not abandonment. It is a pause in the conversation, not the end of it. But if your mind rushes to worst-case scenarios, you strip both yourself and the relationship of the dignity patience affords. Maturity is recognizing that not every unanswered message is a rejection, not every quiet evening is the loss of love, and not every ignored word is the precursor to goodbye. It is the ability to zoom out, to see beyond the immediate, to place this moment in the larger arc of your shared history. Silence can be a form of respect, a recognition that words spoken too soon would only wound. It is often a form of self-discipline rather than disinterest. When she holds back her voice, it may be because she respects the weight of words enough not to throw them carelessly into the air. And the question becomes, do you respect that process, or do you demand constant noise to fill your own void? Relationships are not measured by how often you speak, but by how deeply you understand each other in the spaces where no words are spoken. That depth is not given, it is cultivated through patience, through deliberate choice, through trust that is not shaken by momentary silences. When you learn to sit with silence, you gain access to a deeper layer of human experience. You learn that not everything must be resolved immediately, that some things ripen only with time. You discover that waiting is not weakness, but strength in its highest form. The man who can wait without anger, without fear, without demand, that man holds power beyond measure. Because he is no longer controlled by the fluctuations of external behavior. He is anchored in his own discipline, in his own sense of purpose. Her silence does not threaten him because his foundation is not built on constant validation, but on enduring trust. There is something profoundly noble in choosing not to interpret silence as rejection, but as a sacred space held open for something greater to emerge. This is not naivety. This is wisdom applied to human connection. Wisdom that knows the difference between emptiness and patience, between avoidance and reflection. It is the silent understanding that love is not always loud, that care is not always expressed in constant closeness. Sometimes care is expressed in distance maintained precisely so that the next encounter is not marred by words spoken in haste. When you interpret silence through the lens of maturity, you do not rush to conclusions, nor do you force unnecessary confrontation. You wait, you observe, you trust, you allow her the dignity of her own emotional process, and in doing so you strengthen the very fabric of your bond. Because relationships are not about constant proximity, they are about shared growth, and growth always includes silence, distance, reflection. The man who understands this possesses not just patience, but wisdom, not just endurance, but mastery. Silence, interpreted wisely, becomes not a threat to the relationship, but one of its most essential, powerful tools. There is a kind of strength in restraint that few understand because human instinct often demands immediate validation and instant connection, while deeper bonds are quietly strengthened in the moments when nothing is said and no message is sent, because silence is not the absence of care, but often its most mature and deliberate form. Since unchecked reaction speaks of impulse, But measured distance speaks of discipline and self-awareness that goes beyond simple emotion and reaches into the core of character. When she ignores you, not as a weapon, but as a shield, it is not about rejection, but about preserving something fragile and valuable, because intimacy does not only grow in constant presence, but also in conscious absence, which allows both individuals to reflect and recalibrate rather than suffocate each other with unprocessed feelings or unresolved tension. Relationships that last are not built on relentless attention. They are shaped by moments of deliberate space where emotions are cooled and clarity is cultivated, because closeness without pause can become overwhelming. And sometimes love needs silence to breathe so that it can return stronger. When a woman steps back, it is not because she has forgotten you, but because she remembers too deeply and does not want to damage what she values by acting without thought or patience. Since maturity requires her to regulate not just her own experience, but also how that experience might affect you and the relationship if expressed too soon or too harshly. There is wisdom in knowing when to speak and wisdom in knowing when not to. And in the space where words could cause harm, silence often becomes the most caring choice, because filling every quiet moment with conversation can drown out understanding, while leaving room for silence allows both people to process their emotions independently and come back together with greater clarity and respect. Her withdrawal is a form of balance, because she recognizes that too much immediacy can breed dependency rather than trust, and that trust is only earned when both individuals can stand alone without falling apart in the absence of constant reassurance. Every human connection must withstand tests of patience and emotional endurance, because no relationship can thrive if it crumbles the moment one person pulls back and the other person cannot handle the distance without spiraling into insecurity, since emotional resilience is measured not by how well you handle affection, but by how calmly you endure its temporary absence, knowing that absence does not equal abandonment. In fact, sometimes distance is an act of service, offered quietly, because overwhelming the other person with constant demands for attention can exhaust even the strongest bond, and mature love knows this and chooses discipline over impulse, because impulsive closeness without pause often leads to friction and misunderstanding, while measured distance invites both parties to reflect and return to each other more whole rather than more fractured. To hold back when it would feel easier to speak is an invisible form of power, because silence requires mastery over one's own desires, especially in a world that celebrates immediate expression over deliberate consideration, since unchecked words can damage what has taken months or years to build, while silence protects that fragile construction until the right words can be chosen. When she chooses silence, it is not emptiness, but an act of active restraint, because she understands the weight her words carry and would rather say nothing than say something that might unravel the relationship or create wounds that could take much longer to heal than the few hours or days she spends in quiet reflection. Her silence is not laziness or indifference, but the opposite, a disciplined choice to guard the emotional safety of both herself and the person she cares for, because true strength is not found in constant reaction, but in the ability to pause and let time reveal the right course of action. And silence in relationships teaches both people patience, because waiting through the quiet teaches you to trust that the bond is stronger than temporary absence, and that a mature connection does not demand constant proof of itself, because its foundation is already stable enough to endure the moments when nothing is being said. It is in these quiet moments that self-awareness is deepened, because you are forced to face your own fears and insecurities without using the other person as a crutch or a distraction, since relying too much on someone else's presence to soothe your own anxiety is not love. It is dependency, and dependency without balance always weakens both people involved. By stepping back, she teaches you resilience, because you must learn to stand steady in your own mind and heart, rather than relying on her words to constantly stabilize you, since the strongest relationships are those where both individuals can exist both together and apart without falling into chaos. In a culture that glorifies immediate communication, silence has become a lost art, but it is one of the most essential practices for long-term emotional health, because silence is where reflection lives. And without reflection, relationships become reactionary and reactive rather than deliberate and thoughtful. Since reaction is easy, but reflection requires maturity and discipline. Her silence is a gift that allows space for both of you to reflect rather than to react, because reacting too soon can create conflict where there was only misunderstanding. And misunderstandings left unchecked can fracture trust permanently, while reflection creates the opportunity for healing and clarity without unnecessary damage. Choosing not to engage immediately is not avoidance but strategy, because conflict handled too soon can be far worse than conflict handled after both parties have had time to calm down and assess the true nature of the issue, rather than simply acting on temporary emotion. When she ignores you, it may feel like rejection, but that feeling is often a test of your own emotional endurance, because your reaction in that moment will reveal whether you have the strength to trust her care even when it is not constantly visible. Love is not always loud and obvious. Often it is quiet and steady, holding back in moments of intensity to avoid causing harm, because words spoken in anger can echo longer than silence ever could. It is easy to say what you feel when emotions are high, but it is far more difficult and far more powerful to wait until you can speak from a place of calm clarity instead of emotional chaos. Her silence is not about withholding affection, but about preserving the integrity of the relationship by ensuring that her emotions do not spill out in ways that would damage rather than deepen the bond you share. There is profound respect in choosing silence over unnecessary confrontation, because that choice says, I care enough about you not to hurt you with my unfiltered emotion, and I respect myself enough not to act in ways I will regret later, because regret is a heavy burden in relationships, and avoiding it requires discipline that most people never learn. Her silence is not passive, it is active work done in the background, where she sorts through her thoughts and feelings to bring you something clearer and more constructive when she does finally speak. Because speaking too soon would be like pouring unrefined material into a delicate machine. It would cause more harm than good. By holding back, she is refining her thoughts like metal in a forge, because she wants to give you the best version of her truth, not the raw, unprocessed version that could cut instead of heal. True emotional discipline is found not in constant closeness, but in conscious distance maintained for the sake of clarity and health, because healthy relationships require both connection and separation, like breathing in and breathing out, since constant presence can become suffocating, while deliberate distance allows both people to maintain their individuality and strength. When she ignores you, it is often because she understands this rhythm of closeness and space better than you do, because mature women know that giving too much of themselves, too quickly or too constantly, can lead to emotional exhaustion, while giving space preserves energy and balance for both sides. Her distance is not a wall, it is a window that allows light to filter in slowly rather than all at once, because too much light can blind, while the right amount allows everything to be seen clearly. In the quiet, when she says nothing and you hear only your own thoughts, you are given a rare opportunity to grow, because it is in those moments that you learn patience, resilience, trust, and discipline, since reacting with fear would undo everything she is trying to protect, while responding with calm understanding would prove that you are capable of handling real connection, not just surface-level interaction. Her silence tests you, and in passing that test, you prove not only your strength as a partner, but your strength as an individual who does not need constant validation to feel secure, because the deepest bonds are those that can withstand silence as easily as they can celebrate joy.